Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly brilliant framework from George W. Peters' foundational book, A Biblical Theology of Missions. If you've ever felt completely tangled up in the modern debate over what the church is actually supposed to be doing out there in the world, well, you're going to absolutely love the clarity we're about to uncover.
Let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question. Think about today's culture. It is so incredibly easy to assume that literally every good deed a church does, running a food pantry, hosting a block party, advocating for social justice, is equal to missionary work. But is it? Peters really demands that we hit pause and look at the theology. Because if everything is missions, doesn't the word kind of lose its meaning entirely? Peters actually answers that question with incredible bluntness. He warns us that equating general social action with missions leads directly to, and this is his exact phrase, pathetic confusion. Wow, that is a heavy phrase. Now, he definitely isn't saying social action is bad. Far from it. But he is arguing that when we blur the lines of our biblical mandates, we completely lose the sharp focus required for global evangelization. So we really need to define our terms here. All right, let's zoom out to part one, the big picture. The church's broad assignment. Before we get into the weeds, Peters establishes a baseline. He defines the church as a divine creation. It's not just some social club or a nonprofit. It is literally God's unique possession. And its primary function? To exist as a witnessing fellowship to the entire world. This is the overarching identity of the church. Every single believer is a part of this fellowship, and it's the solid foundation that everything else is built on. Moving right along to part two, core distinctions, mission versus missions. Okay, this is the absolute crux of the matter. We have to understand the difference between two terms we constantly use interchangeably. First, we have mission, singular. That's the broad calling of every single believer. It covers upward ministry to God, inward ministry to the body of believers, and outward ministry to the world. We are all called to be salt and light, right? But then we have missions, plural, and this is highly specialized. It specifically refers to sending authorized people beyond the borders of the local church to proclaim the gospel and plant new multiplying congregations. Now, this specialized task is totally driven by God's all-embracing intent to save humanity. Peters maps this out into three distinct types of universality. First step is ideal universality, which is God's gracious provision of salvation for absolutely everyone. That's deeply biblical. Second is practical universality, meaning it's God's will that the gospel actually be proclaimed so everyone has a chance to hear it. Also deeply biblical. But then there's the third type, realized universality. This is the theory that all people are already saved, and Peters strictly rejects this. He calls it completely extra-biblical. And because people aren't automatically saved, that specialized task of sending out missionaries, it remains absolutely fundamentally urgent. Let's dive into part three, deep understanding, the stages of ministry. So, how does this actually play out in the real world? It happens in a very specific progression. Step one is evangelization, authoritatively proclaiming the message to non-believers. Then, once someone believes, they enter step two, Christianization. This is the lifelong process of really embedding Christ's principles into their everyday life. Step three is socialization, where they conform to the ideals of a local church body. And finally, step four, civilization, which is broad cultural development. But Peters throws in a pretty sobering caveat here. He notes that a perfectly Christian civilization doesn't actually exist anywhere on earth. It's a continuous, ongoing process. Which brings us to part four, methodologies, from magnetism to sending. You might be wondering, how did God's methods actually shift over the course of history? Well, look at the Old Testament approach. Peters calls this the centripetal method. Basically, it was a giant come invitation. But flip over to the New Testament, and we see the centrifugal method. This is a massive, game-changing shift to a go mandate. It's where authorized messengers actively cross frontiers and push the message outward. To really wrap our heads around that Old Testament idea, we have to look at this absolutely incredible phrase Peters uses, sacred magnetism. Think about that. Israel wasn't originally commanded to send cross-cultural church planters all over the globe. Instead, they were meant to experience God's presence so radiantly that it naturally acted like a giant magnet. The surrounding nations were supposed to look at them and just be drawn inward to Jerusalem. So that major shift from passive magnetism to the active, explosive sending of the New Testament, that is the very birth of missions as we know it. All right, let's talk application in part five, the two divine mandates. If we want to avoid falling back into that pathetic confusion we talked about earlier, we absolutely have to separate the cultural mandate from the spiritual mandate. The first mandate was given to Adam, way back in the garden, and it's entirely cultural, the call to populate, dominate, and cultivate the earth. But the second mandate is entirely spiritual. This is the gospel mandate given directly to the apostles, focused squarely on spiritual liberation and church planting. Here's the thing. Both are God-given and both are vital. When a church builds a hospital or a school, it is beautifully fulfilling that cultural mandate. But unless it is also actively crossing borders to plant congregations, it's not actually engaging in the specific spiritual mandate of missions.
Wrapping things up with part 6. Summary: the call of the sent.
Bringing all these threads together, we finally arrive at Peter's precise technical definition. A missionary is a sent one, a highly authorized messenger. They have received a specific, incredibly selective call to cross national or cultural lines for the sole purpose of preaching and establishing new congregations. This perfectly bookends our whole discussion, proving that being a missionary is a distinct technical calling. It is completely different from a believer's general, everyday duty to be a good witness right at home. It requires intentionally packing up and crossing borders. I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to chew on regarding your own unique role in all of this. If you're a believer, you are absolutely called to the singular mission of the church, right? To be salt and light in your own community. But have you perhaps received that highly selective, authorized call to plural missions? Understanding the difference between the two doesn't just clear up pathetic confusion, it actually empowers you to pursue your exact God-given purpose with total laser-like clarity. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking that clarity.